When you look at the headlines streaming across your screen about Venezuela, about Maduro's dramatic capture, and the military operation that stunned the world, it's easy to get caught up in the immediate spectacle of a strongman leader being flown to a New York courtroom in shackles. But if you step back from the drama and look at the numbers, at the shipping routes, and the billion-dollar contracts that were severed in a matter of hours, you start to see something much larger unfolding. This isn't just about regime change in Caracas. This is about the fundamental rewiring of global energy flows that have been decades in the making. The relationship between China and Venezuela wasn't built on ideology or shared political values. It was built on something much more practical and much more valuable: oil. For years, China has been the largest purchaser of Venezuelan crude, a relationship that survived sanctions, international pressure, and the collapse of Venezuela's economy. According to energy analysts, China typically imports between 400,000 to 600,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, representing about 4 to 5% of China's total oil consumption. That might sound small, but in the world of energy geopolitics, even small percentages carry enormous strategic weight. What made this relationship particularly valuable for Beijing wasn't just the oil itself, but the leverage it provided. Venezuela became China's foothold in Latin America, a way to project economic and political influence right in what has traditionally been America's backyard. Through loans, infrastructure projects, and long-term energy contracts, China had essentially created a client state that could challenge U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. When President Trump launched those strikes on Saturday morning, he didn't just capture Maduro, he severed one of China's most important strategic lifelines in the Americas. The immediate response from Beijing tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they view this loss. China's foreign ministry called the operation hegemonic acts and accused the United States of a blatant use of force against a sovereign state. But behind that diplomatic language, there's a much more urgent calculation happening in the halls of power in Beijing. Chinese officials had met with Venezuelan representatives just hours before the American operation began, suggesting they were caught completely off guard by the timing and scale of the intervention. You have to understand what this means in the context of China's broader energy security strategy. China imports about 70% of its oil, making it one of the most vulnerable major economies when it comes to energy disruption. For decades, Chinese strategists have been working to diversify their suppliers to avoid being too dependent on any single region or any single set of shipping routes. Venezuela was a crucial part of that diversification, not because it provided the most oil, but because it provided oil from a region where China could build long-term political relationships and reduce American influence. The genius of China's Venezuela strategy wasn't just about buying oil, it was about buying influence. Through a series of loans and investment deals worth billions of dollars, China effectively became Venezuela's banker, its primary economic patron when Western financial institutions withdrew during the sanctions era. This gave Beijing enormous leverage not just over Venezuelan energy policy, but over Venezuelan foreign policy more broadly. When China needed support for its positions on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on its disputes in the South China Sea, Venezuela was reliably there to provide diplomatic backing. Now, with Maduro in a Manhattan jail cell and Trump announcing that the United States will run Venezuela until a transition can be arranged, all of those carefully constructed relationships are in jeopardy. The new Venezuelan government, whatever form it ultimately takes, will be under enormous pressure to distance itself from Chinese influence and align with American interests. For China, this represents not just an economic loss, but a strategic disaster. Let's talk about the numbers that really matter here. According to energy market analysts, China has invested approximately $4 to $5 billion in Venezuelan energy infrastructure over the past decade. These aren't just oil purchases. These are long-term investments in refineries, drilling equipment, and transportation networks. Much of this infrastructure is now under the control of whatever government the United States chooses to support in Venezuela. From a Chinese perspective, they've essentially lost billions of dollars in assets overnight, with no clear legal recourse for recovery. But the financial losses, significant as they are, pale in comparison to the strategic implications. China's Belt and Road Initiative, its signature foreign policy program under Xi Jinping, has always been about creating economic dependencies that translate into political influence. Venezuela was one of the crown jewels of this strategy in Latin America, a major oil producer that could serve as a hub for Chinese influence throughout the region. With that hub now under American control, China's entire Latin American strategy needs to be reconsidered. The timing of this operation is particularly damaging for Chinese interests because it comes at a moment when global energy markets are already under stress. According to industry reports, oil prices spiked immediately following news of the Venezuelan operation, creating exactly the kind of market volatility that China's economic planners spend enormous resources trying to avoid. China's state-owned energy companies, which had negotiated favorable long-term contracts with the Maduro regime, now face the prospect of renegotiating those deals with a government that will be much more aligned with American interests and much less willing to offer Beijing preferential terms. What makes this particularly concerning for Chinese strategists is the precedent it sets. If the United States is willing to use military force to remove governments that provide economic advantages to Chinese interests, then no Chinese investment anywhere in the world is truly secure. This operation sends a signal to every developing country that has accepted Chinese loans or signed energy deals with Beijing. Alignment with China could make you a target for American intervention. The reaction from Chinese state media has been telling in its restraint. Usually, when Chinese interests are threatened this directly, you see a much more aggressive propaganda response. But in this case, Chinese commentators have been notably cautious, focusing on calls for respect for international law rather than threatening any kind of retaliation. This suggests that Beijing understands it has limited options for responding to what is essentially a fait accompli. You also have to consider this in the context of the broader US-China competition that has defined global politics for the past several years. Trade wars, technology restrictions, military buildups in the South China Sea, all of these have been relatively contained conflicts where both sides could claim some victories and some losses. But the Venezuela operation represents something different. It represents the United States using military force to directly sever a major Chinese economic relationship, something that goes well beyond the bounds of traditional economic competition. From China's perspective, this operation demonstrates that the United States is willing to escalate the competition in ways that Beijing may not be prepared to match. China's military is focused primarily on regional conflicts, particularly the potential for conflict over Taiwan. But the Venezuelan operation shows that the United States is thinking globally, willing to project military power anywhere in the world where Chinese interests might be vulnerable. The energy implications extend far beyond the immediate loss of Venezuelan crude. China has been working for years to create what analysts call energy silk roads, alternative supply routes that reduce dependence on shipping lanes controlled by the U.S. Navy. Venezuela was a key component of this strategy because it offered direct access to Latin American energy resources without having to transit through potentially hostile waters. With that access now compromised, China will be forced to rely more heavily on suppliers in the Middle East and Africa, regions where American influence is also significant. There's also the question of what happens to China's existing contracts and investments in Venezuela. Under international law, a new government is generally not bound by the contracts signed by its predecessor, especially if that predecessor is deemed illegitimate. This means that billions of dollars in Chinese investments could simply be written off as losses, with no legal recourse available to Chinese companies or the Chinese government. Perhaps most importantly, this operation forces China to confront a fundamental limitation in its global strategy. For all of China's economic power, for all of its investments in military modernization, it lacks the ability to project military power globally in the way that the United States can. China can threaten Taiwan because Taiwan is in its immediate neighborhood, but it cannot protect Chinese interests in Venezuela because Venezuela is on the other side of the world, well within what the United States considers its sphere of influence. This asymmetry in global reach puts China at a fundamental disadvantage in any competition with the United States that extends beyond purely economic measures. The Venezuela operation demonstrates that the United States can, when it chooses to, simply eliminate Chinese economic relationships through the use of military force, and there is very little that China can do in response except issue diplomatic protests. The broader implications for global energy markets are still unfolding, but early indicators suggest that this could mark a significant shift in how energy relationships are structured. If the United States is willing to use military force to reshape energy flows in its favor, then every major energy producer in the world has to recalculate their relationships with both Washington and Beijing. Countries that have been balancing between American and Chinese interests may now feel pressure to choose sides more definitively. For China, the loss of Venezuela represents more than just a setback in one relationship. It represents a demonstration of American willingness to use military force to maintain its global dominance in ways that China cannot match. This could force Beijing to reconsider its entire approach to global competition, potentially accelerating military modernization efforts, or alternatively, encouraging a more cautious approach to challenging American interests in regions where the United States maintains clear military advantages. The energy flows that were severed this weekend took years to build and billions of dollars to establish. They represented not just commercial relationships, but strategic partnerships that were central to China's vision of a multipolar world where American dominance could be challenged through economic means. In the space of a few hours, that entire framework was demolished, leaving China to confront the reality that economic power, however substantial, cannot always compete with military power when the stakes are high enough and the will to use that power is present. As this story continues to unfold, we'll be watching to see how Beijing responds, not just diplomatically, but strategically. Does China accept this setback and look for alternative ways to build influence in Latin America? Does it accelerate efforts to build military capabilities that could deter future American interventions? Or does it recalculate its entire global strategy in recognition that direct competition with the United States carries risks that may outweigh the potential benefits? What happened in Venezuela this weekend wasn't just about oil or even about geopolitics in the traditional sense. It was about the demonstration of power at its most fundamental level, the ability to reshape global relationships through the credible threat or actual use of military force. For China, which has built its rise on the assumption that economic power could eventually challenge military dominance, this operation provides a harsh reminder that in the final analysis, the country with the strongest military still gets to write the rules of the global game.